Content creation is a complicated profession. I have so many favorite books, but I think in terms of talking about comics that I personally adore, and I would probably consider to be, one of the best reads ever, it has to be the late, great Darwin Cook's DC The New Frontier, which is an impeccable story that marries kind of Cook's knowledge of American history, specifically the Cold War era American history, and his love for the Silver and Bronze Ages, the Golden Age and Silver Age of DC Comics. And that story is it is effortlessly perfect. It is so stunning. Cook was just such a master of his craft, and whether he was working on Catwoman, doing Selina's Big School, or working on Batman with Batman Ego, he just always seemed to just nail the voices of these characters. You never really came across a character in one of his books and thought, that doesn't sound like Batman, that doesn't sound like Flash. He got it all right, and not only did he do that, he helped periodize DC in such a way with that series, whereas, back in the Golden Age and Silver Age of comics, the most political comics ever really got was you had World War II, and you had Superman being a very clear, obvious working class hero. But they kind of skirted over things like the Civil Rights Movement, for instance, and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And The New Frontier kind of just re-centralizes that as a narrative, but basically poses the question, what if DC's heroes came out in the actual history of the time? And it is such a stunning comic because not only is it a great superhero story that kind of cuts to the very core of what makes DC such a compelling mythos, but it also does it in such a way that kind of just the history itself is so well handled. It isn't just a great comic book about DC superheroes, it's also a fantastic story about the long 1960s. And it is such a great read for that very reason, and written perfectly, absolutely stunning to look at. You can get some absolutely incredible absolute editions which have loads and loads of pages of Cook's actual backup art. And yeah, New Frontier, an absolutely stunning read. If you can't read it, I'd definitely suggest you watch the animated movie, which is fantastic. And yeah, DC The New Frontier, my favorite comic of all time.
Right, well the thing about this, and I'm sure it's also the thing that Ewan has a problem with, is that since I've read all the damn comics, finding one exact one is always going to be a matter of what had the most reaction on you personally. And for me, it has to be Matt Fraction's Hawkeye run. I think it's a real it has a cult following, but I don't know if it's necessarily celebrated, which I think it very much should be, because it takes the role of a superhero and says, well, what if this person that you respect, that you think can do all these amazing things, what if they are just a completely ordinary dude, sit in their apartment, has a divorce, eats pizza the next morning. And I think I had a special connection with the idea that to be a superhero, you don't need to have superpowers, you don't need to be a billionaire, you don't even necessarily need to be smart. You just have to have a hope that you can make life better for other people, and that, maybe you need a pizza dog to help you out. Maybe that's fine, but at the same time, yeah, all it takes is you, a bit of hope, and maybe some professional archery skills. And I think that's pretty good.
I didn't think that Brian Lee O'Malley's Seconds would be my answer for this, because it's not the comic that I've read the most, it's not the comic that I even think about the most, but when I was going through my head of the comics that have sort of defined me as a person, that one kept sticking out. And I think I know why, because it's about Katie, who essentially gets this notebook and she gets a little mushroom that she writes in her mistakes, and then the next day she wakes up and those mistakes are gone. And as someone who has lots of regrets and wants his life to be perfect, I resonate with this very much so. But it's about her, she's sort of struggling, she owns a restaurant, she's got relationship trouble, she's essentially just trying to get through her 20s like so many people are. And a lot of people in their 20s, she has a lot of regrets, she has a lot of worries, she has a lot of anxieties over the future, and those are so well drawn in this kind of, fantastical space that grounds it in real human emotion and experience, and then lets you go into the story of, oh, what if you could undo everything? And like a lot of people, she tries to literally not only have a good life, but she tries to have the perfect life, and every little mistake, obviously she tries to rectify, and she takes way more mushrooms than what she was supposed to do, and she kind of realizes that she's only making herself worse. She's only making herself, more unhappy, because nothing could be as perfect as she imagines. And as someone who always lives by the philosophy that if I ever got 3 wishes by a genie, Will Smith's genie popped up and was like, Josh, what do you want? The answer would always be 3 more wishes, because I don't think I'd ever be fully satisfied. I would never be satisfied, Jules. I'm not proud of it. I just know that deep down, I would be that idiot who's like, come on, Will. Come on, Big Willie. Give me 3 more. And I just keep asking for 3 more. Because the whole point of life isn't necessarily, trying to be perfect. It's about working through your mistakes. And allowing them to be as much a part of you as your successors. And I find that very much since I've become, a 20-something like Katie is in the story, that just is even more salient and relevant. I haven't actually read it in a long time because I read it when it first came out. When I was a bit younger, I think I was 18 or 19, and now I'm the same age as Katie, and I was going to reread it for this Chatty Faces, but I couldn't, because I was like, this is going to hit too close to home and probably give me an existential crisis, but it is lovely, it is hopeful, and the art is gorgeous, and Brian Lee O'Malley just, he can do so much with such simple visuals, whether it's emotion or jokes or, humor and stuff, and it's just a great sort of singular piece of work that I will revisit one day and probably have a cry over again.
Well, I might get some flack for this, but I'm going to go with The Walking Dead, more specifically the prison arc, which it was before the whole popularity of the TV show took off, which I think was when it was at its strongest. And it's just basically because the whole arc, you've got all the characters dying, you've got them finally settling down for the first time as well, which hadn't happened before in the comic. And it's topped all off by issue 48, which is when the governor attacks the prison. And it's got some of the most gory things I've ever seen put to the page. I think now, being a father myself, when Laurie gets shot and she actually falls on baby Judith and crushes her, and there's that little panel and you see the baby's arm sticking out from underneath her, and it's just somebody drew that, really? But yeah, I think it probably tapered off a little bit after issue 100, and especially with the whole TV show thing kind of affecting Robert Kirkman's writing. He says it didn't, but it definitely did. But yeah, I think before issue 100, The Walking Dead is probably my favourite comic book of all time.
My favourite comic book ever, Ewan, is going to come with a slight caveat because forever and ever is a long time. So it's for right now. And it's mostly because I've always liked comics and I've been at them quite a bit, much more as a kid. But as I got older, other things have got in the way. Life, work, women. Hey? Oh, man. It's been a busy year. But what I will say is that this particular comic got me back into comics properly, reading on a weekly basis, and kind of just excited about just getting back into the whole thing in general. The comic is Venom, is Donny Cates' Venom. There's something about Donny Cates' writing that has literally completely charmed me, and I'm sure many other people across the world of comic books, because it's just fantastic. The story of Venom was always one that I wasn't bothered about, but he was an additional character in Spider-Man. And obviously when the film came out, I remember thinking is there a big market for that? Is that something?
Eminem, eh?
Yeah, I was am I interested? I went to see it. Still, I enjoyed it, by the way, I should point out. But I wasn't sure if that was a story. But then I read this and I can completely understand why this has happened. Finally making Eddie Brock what feels like a much more three-dimensional character, somebody who I am actually interested in, who wasn't just whether you know the backstory or not, this is a character you can relate to. And I think actually, funnily enough, in the interview you guys did with Donny Cates for WhatCulture Comics, you can check that out on the channel. The way he talks about the simplicity of, essentially, it's a story about a very simple theme, man and son, or man and his battle with the world sort of thing. Love that he breaks it down at that simplicity, but it just made me interested, and it was Venom has been a delight, from volume 1, volume 2, currently the volume 1 at the moment, that's obviously led in perfectly to all of the Absolute Carnage stuff. I do have to give a quick shout out to my cousin who, I was trying to find a comic that I enjoyed. I was flirting with the idea of reading Absolute Carnage as it came out, and he said you should do the Venom stuff first, which leads in. Well, you're right, Tom. It does, and it was fantastic, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and really, I am going to, when this all comes out in a sizable volume that obviously I can just put in there and look at it and think, oh, that's pretty, and revisit time and time again. I'm absolutely going to buy this, along with the Absolute Carnage, because they've both been fantastic, and genuinely, I am fascinated to know what comes next in both of them, which I haven't had that with comic book in a long, long time. I should also give a shout out to you as well, because Donny Cates' Cosmic Ghost Rider is a little one that doesn't make the best ever for me right now, but it was bloody good. Really enjoyed that. So yeah, just a big Donny Cates love fest this really.
We love you, Donny Cates.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. More of the same, please. And that is my favourite comic book ever / for right now.
My favourite comic of all time was actually quite hard to pin down because, as we were discussing earlier, there's loads that I've kind of read or had sort of dumped on me that I feel have been impactful, but I'm never really sure what I would consider to be the best. It's really hard to pick out. But I think probably the one that had, or at least the arc that had the most impact on me, was probably the 1979 Demon in a Bottle arc for Iron Man. Like, I honestly think that it's not something, it's got lots of striking imagery in it, but it's not necessarily what you consider to be the best animated, it's not the best drawn, but the story that is there is so powerful that I feel like it's as relevant today as it was back then, because it's about breaking down layers of your personality, accepting your own flaws and taking responsibility. And I feel like they managed to address all of that while dealing with a quite engaging whodunit mystery of Iron Man's suit being hijacked and him accidentally killing an ambassador, like pretty heavy stuff. And then him using alcohol to deal with these problems and sort of distancing himself away from all of this, thinking, oh, I can just get through this. After all, I'm Iron Man. But it's about how it's fracturing him, all of the events around him, Justin Hammer coming in and basically using all of these supervillains to, again, like taunt him, break him down further, showing that he's having his suit and technology hijacked. And without that, what is he? I know that the films answered that he's, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, but at that time, he was like, Jesus, what do I have outside of being incredibly smart and using this technology? And after all of his problems seek in, and you see him hit the bottle again and again and again, you start to realize that this is a really bleak narrative. And I love the way that it ends. It doesn't just end with like, he beat alcoholism and everything was fine and dandy and we'll all walk off into the sunset. It was a story that was like, it's an optimistic future, but there's still challenges ahead. And I feel like that was the best way that Marvel could have moved forward with that story, because it was a case of not just addressing the problems, but admitting that it's going to be hard to deal with your demons in the future. And as a kid at the time, when I read this at university, when I was going through my own stuff, I was just like, I needed to hear that at the time. And I swear that loads of people reading it today would probably still feel the same. It's, like I said, still very relevant. So yeah. Hands down, I'd say that has to be my favourite comic book arc of all time.
I played with the idea of saying Civil War because Civil War got me back into comics after I sort of lapsed a little bit. Because of the broadness of the event and the way all of the satellite issues tied in, I was very impressed. Great story, naturally, but that isn't my favourite comic. It's certainly not the one I've read the most. It's not the most important one. It's not the one that sort of changed my opinion of comics. And all of those are one comic, which is in fact a graphic novel, which is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's probably less familiar to a lot of the audience than a lot of the things that'll come up in this Chatty Faces, because I'm old and wise. But it's basically a memoir of the Holocaust. So it's Art Spiegelman talking to his father about his experience as a Polish refugee and the Nazi situation, let's say. But it's told all of the Jewish community are mice, Germans are cats, Poles are pigs, and it's sort of like it sort of blends like Animal Farm with this real life memoir, and it tells the story, and it's phenomenal. The story is obviously very compelling because it's a very compelling story. It's very compelling history. The artwork is brilliant because Art Spiegelman is an artist predominantly, and the whole approach, it's just so shocking. Like, it takes this tremendously emotional story, which is horrible and all these things. It's sort of up there with The Pianist in terms of like, this is awful. But then it's mice, cartoon mice telling this whole story, and it sort of makes it like feel even more jarring because it's the medium clashes with what it's actually saying, and it's just so profoundly brilliant that I told everybody that I knew to read it after I'd read it. And the best thing about it, when I had those conversations, was it was not like I was saying go and read a comic book, because people would be like, well, that's a comic book, I'm a grown person, why would I do that? It's more like this sort of historical document, because it's about this one guy's experience, but it's also about the entire story of the war. And honestly, it's unbelievably good. If you haven't checked it out, go and do so because it's brilliant and it will change your life.
Okay, I've got two. One's the one I had before I came here, and then the second one is a bit of a story behind it. So the comic I loved the most in the world before I came to WhatCulture was sort of like an early 2000s comic called World's Funnest. It's like a Mr. Mixie Spitlick versus Batmite story. I don't know if you know it. But basically they run through loads of different universes, just kicking the ass of everyone there, killing loads of versions of Superman and Batman. They beat up the Spectre like twice. And I love it because each universe they go to parodies like a different style of comic, a different artwork. There's a really good parody of like Frank Miller. There's a really good parody of like the 1950s weirdly sexist Wonder Woman. It's really funny, and it kind of, for me, comics were always something that I enjoyed the stories of, but not something to take too seriously. And this, I really loved how it made fun of them. But then I sort of came here, and I started reading more about comics because I was reading them aloud. And then I also started editing comic book videos. And there was one that I got given, which was voiced by Ewan.
Hey, this guy!
Yeah, which was on a series called Gotham Central. Woo! Which is just an amazing series. It's set in Gotham, it's about the GCPD. And what I love about it is it doesn't really heavily feature Batman at all, but it has access to all that lore that Batman's created over the years. So you've got like 80 years of comics, and then you get to draw all that in from a completely different perspective. You have that wonderful human perspective, because I mean, Batman is obviously human, but you know, is he really? And it's absolutely incredible. And the issue that I read was Half a Life. And I won't go into it too much because it is a mystery, but it really hit home that comics could, and this is probably something you'll hear a lot in this video, that comics were more than just for kids, for me. Because I was reading this story and I was like, this is a real human story, this is what's actually happening, this is how people would behave. I love the artwork, it's just a gorgeous story, like very bittersweet. And it really spoke to me, and it was one of those ones where I was editing it because I have to scroll through the comics to get the pictures because it was for Ewan's voiceover. And I ended up just reading it, and I spent like 4 hours, just wasted 4 hours just reading this comic, and I just got to the end and I was like wow. And that's really the point where comics started becoming something that I just was sort of aware of, and there were things that the TVs, like, you know, when I was a kid I loved Spectacular Spider-Man, forget about it, like Batman the Animated Series. The comics were just sort of the things I like came from, and that's the point where comics started becoming something that improved my life every day, like a passion that I'll keep across my entire life, something that will benefit me my whole life. And it comes straight from sort of the friends I have here, and I suppose indirectly from everyone watching. It's something that I have to enjoy for my whole life that comes straight from you guys. And all that's wrapped up for me in Gotham Central 6, which is Half a Life. So yeah, that's my favorite comic.